Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai chapter 6, Halacha 7 in the Art Scroll 62a2. Now, in the last Halacha, in chapter 6, Halacha 6, we were talking about the division of property with an inheritance. And now the Mishnah is going to talk about the case of someone who converts to Judaism, and now there's an inheritance with a non-Jewish brother, and they're going to get the possessions from the father who is an idol worshiper. And then basically he's going to want to exchange his share of the father's idols and Nesach wine as well. Nesach wine, you're not allowed to have any wine that has any benefit from an idol, and the wine can also be used for services toward an idol. So one is biblically forbidden to benefit from any kind of idol, including the wine. And then if you had an exchange, like for something that you're d'oraita forbidden to have any benefit from, well, that's going to be forbidden for benefit. And so that exchange would not be kosher. It's not a clean exchange. And so he wants to, he's going to get an inheritance, and he wants to exchange with his idol-worshipping brother for money or produce. Now, you'd say to yourself, why is this in here? Why is this in Demai? And actually, there's a sugya that's going to be coming up at the end of the conversation on this convert, and it's actually going to relate to Brera, and it's going to relate to crops. Rabbi Zera is going to point out how this does relate back to crops. And basically, it's going to be talking about things that are going to be alike. So in the case of the money for the share in an idol or the Nesach wine or an image of an idol, well, those two things are not going to be treated as something that's alike. And that also is going to come back with something that perhaps is going to be wheat, that can be Demai and Tahor. Perhaps you have an inheritance in a totally kosher Jewish way with an Amma Aretz father and two Jews. One is an Amma Aretz and one is a Haver, and they're going to both be getting wheat. They're getting a whole pile of wheat, but one is Demai and one is Tahor. Well, that's going to be a case that's going to be similar to how this convert is going to be inheriting, because you can't split up these dissimilar things one for the other in certain ways, and in certain ways you can. So this is in here, and it looks like it's not relevant, but it is. And it also, by the way, continues this conversation of brera or no brera. Again, brera is going to be this retroactive taking hold of something, so that before something is done, it's not some way, and then after brera and after this thing takes effect, retroactively, it's going to have a different status. So that, again, is a Maloket Tanayim that even goes back to the older Tanayim, whether there's going to be brera or not. So we see that that's a conversation in other sugyas and mishnahs between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer. So over here, the Mishnah says, if a convert and a non-Jew who are brothers inherited their non-Jewish father's property, a convert may say to his brother, you take the idols and I take the money. Or he can say, you take the Nesach wine and I take the produce, the permissible produce. And that's going to be okay. And one of the things to talk about this is that ordinarily brothers who inherit from their father are automatically equal owners in every item in an estate from the moment that the father dies. But in the case of a convert, he would be forbidden to take items in lieu of other items, in lieu of the idols, because once he has gained ownership of the idols, exchanging them constitutes a derivation of benefit from the owner. So in reality, the convert does not inherit his father by biblical law. That's why this is in here. And part of this is that by biblical law, a convert does not inherit his father, because the act of conversion causes a person to be born anew, and that severs his former tie to his former family. And then it means that the convert's father, while biologically related to him in a genealogical sense, is no longer his kin. So the convert is no longer his heir and cannot inherit him. But the rabbis made a decree. This you, by the way, can find in Bavli Kiddushin 17b. And the rabbis made a decree that a convert can take a share in the inheritance because the rabbis were worried that some portion of idol-worshipping people that converted would go back to being an idol worshiper in order to get an inheritance. And so to make sure that this person can still get a portion of his father's legacy, they made a d'Rabbanan thing. Now, the rabbi's decree is going to be based on the worry that a convert would mistakenly assume that returning to idol worship, he could obtain a share in the inheritance. And conversion is irreversible, but in this kind of case, you don't want the person going back. So that's why the rabbis made this decree. Now, ordinarily, the brothers are going to become equal owners, but in this case, you have a d'Rabbanan thing. That's, by the way, d'Oraita. In the Torah itself, it talks about inheritance. But over here, this is d'Rabbanan inheritance. That's what's so interesting about it. So the convert, he's not actually getting possession yet. And that's what makes it so interesting. And so he's saying before he actually gets possession, why don't you take these idols and wine, and I'll just take this produce. And because it doesn't come into his possession yet, he can do that. But if it did come into his possession, he's not allowed to do it because he's not allowed to benefit from an idol in any way. And you can't make a trade for idols. So in this case, before it comes into his possession, he's simply allocating them to his brother as his brother's share of inheritance. And then the money or produce is not regarded as coming to him in exchange for the idols, and then that transaction gets to be permitted. So, although, says the Tosafot, the rabbis, this by the way, Tosafot is in Bavli Kiddushin 17b, although the rabbis did decree that a convert is entitled to a share of the father's inheritance, the legislation was limited to items from which the convert may legally derive benefit. So, idols are going to be forbidden, and even after this rabbinic decree, he's never going to own any share in the idol. He cannot. So that's going to be over here. Now, that's going to be the difference between this Mishnah and the last Mishnah in Demai chapter 6, Halacha 6. Over there, in the last Mishnah, it's ruling that a haver who inherits together with the Am Haaretz may not tell him, you take the wheat and I take the barley. Because in that case, says the Mara Fulda, in that case of the Mishnah, since the brothers inherit their father by biblical law, the wheat and the barley are regarded as their joint property immediately upon the father's death. But over here, it's not his property yet. And it's a d'Rabbanan inheritance. So if we were talking about the idol worshiper inheriting barley, and there's barley and wheat, okay? And there's no idol there. And again, this is d'Rabbanan inheritance where you have a convert and the idol worshipping brother. Well, you could make that exchange where you say, oh, you take the barley and I take the wheat. Why? Because in the last Mishnah, that was inheritance by biblical law. And this is going to be permitted in this case because it's d'Rabbanan. This is a d'Rabbanan inheritance. And so the logic here is going to match in the case where, in this pool of inheritance, there's idols and there's some grain. And it's going to be the same as when the convert saying, well, why don't you take the idols and I'll take the grain, and then that will be our split. So effectively, this money or produce is not regarded as coming to him in exchange for the idol, or in this case, it's going to be an inheritance that is going to be d'Rabbanan. It's not a biblical inheritance. Now, if it was a biblical inheritance, it would be theirs right away. And then there's no way to split it because it came into the possession immediately. So this is a nuance that looks like it really does not have relevance. Like, why is this in here about the idol worshippers? This is trying to talk about even in a case where you had a convert and a non-Jew who are brothers, and they're going to inherit from the non-Jewish father. And again, now you have a case where this one has wheat and this one has barley, just like what the last Mishnah was saying. The halacha would not be the same as what we saw in the last halacha, because that's biblical inheritance and this is not. And so this kind of exchange is going to have the opposite answer, and you wouldn't know that without this Mishnah. The Gemara now is going to talk to things that are obviously in the laws of Demai. That was also in the law of Demai. But it takes a little bit of digging and a little bit of thinking to see how it's connected, but it is. Rebbe really does put these things together in a very connected, smart way, and this is relevant. So, getting back to this obvious case of Demai, the Mishnah is going to talk about the case of an Amma Aretz who's selling produce in Syria. And Syria is going to be a land that has some status of Eretz Yisrael, but again, that's going to be a maloket, and there's a lot of leniencies over there. There's a lot of derabanan things over here. So we're now getting into this other area of this land that you kind of have a question like, well, what is the status? All of this in the Mishnah are tied together by derabanan things. The law of inheritance is derabanan in the case of the convert, and then the produce in Syria is also going to be derabanan. So the Mishnah says if one who sells, who is an Amma Aretz, sells produce in Syria, and he says, the produce that I have here is from the land of Israel, the buyer is obligated to tithe it. Why is that? Well, the produce of Eretz Yisrael, that's going to be subject to the laws of tithing and Demai after you export it to another country. That, by the way, we saw earlier in this Gemara, in this Masechet. So now you're in Syria and you're buying from the Amma Aretz. The Amma Aretz makes a testimony saying that this produce came from Eretz Yisrael. Well, that buyer must treat it as Demai. He has to separate out all the tithes. Now, if the seller didn't say where this is, the buyer would not have to tithe it. Why? Because most of the produce sold in Syria was imported from other areas outside of Eretz Yisrael, or it was grown locally, and that's not going to be included in the Demai enactment. And we covered this in the Mishnah in chapter 1, halacha 3, and you can find that in the Shir in chapter 1, halacha 3. So the reason that most of the land in Syria would also make it so that if the guy didn't say anything, you wouldn't have to tithe it, is because most of the land in Syria was held by non-Jews, and so in all likelihood, it was grown by a non-Jew on non-Jewish owned land, and that's not going to be subject to tithes in Syria. And the produce in Syria for non-owned Jewish property was excluded from this rabbinic tithing obligation in Syria. So somebody who's buying produce in Syria, says Rabbi Kanievsky, may normally assume that it does not need to be tithed, but in this case, the seller volunteered the information that the produce came from Eretz Yisrael, and that's why the buyer has to tithe it. Now, normally, an Amma Aretz is not trusted regarding tithes or Demai or things like that. Their testimony is not regarded. However, this is different, and this is part of what they're trying to say, that these claims are where if the person kept quiet about the origin of the produce, you wouldn't have to tithe it, because again, the produce from Syria is generally assumed to be either from Syria or non-Jewish owned property in Syria, or from some area surrounding it, like Turkey or something like that. And so over here now, the Amma Aretz is saying something that weakens his case. That's going to be a case of migo. And so he's making this weaker claim. And again, if he wanted to lie, he would have said, a strong claim. And in this case, he would have just said nothing. But again, what he did was he said that it has to be tithed. And by saying, it comes from Eretz Yisrael, it means it has to be tithed. And it means that you're going to make a deduction on how much value you're going to pay for this. So effectively, he's weakened his case because he's not going to get the same amount of money as he would if he said nothing, and it would be assumed that this produce came from Syria or surrounding area that's outside of Eretz Yisrael. So he testified against himself and weakened his claim, and effectively what he did is he's going to be creating a testimony that makes it a trustworthy claim. That's the nuance here. So again, normally an Am Haaretz is not trusted on these things. However, this is a case of migo. So the Mishnah continues, says, but if the Am Haaretz adds that the produce has already been tithed, he is believed, and the buyer need not tithe it. For the very mouth that has forbidden the produce by declaring it to be from Eretz Yisrael is a mouth that permitted the produce by claiming it to already be tithed. So again, we have this case of migo, and that's going to be this legal argument which states that if a person had the ability to make a claim that definitely would have been accepted, but instead he made the weaker claim, we believe the weaker claim. And since if he wanted to lie and make a strong claim, he'd say nothing. And in this case, he made the weaker claim by saying it came from Eretz Yisrael. And then that's going to be the weaker claim. If, again, it was sold in Syria, you would say nothing. So this weak claim where he's saying it comes from Eretz Yisrael, but it's been tithed, that's going to be believed. And over here, if he wanted to lie, he would make the strong claim, and that would be by staying silent and saying nothing. So since the person here is our only source of information regarding what the status is, just as we believed him concerning the prohibition or liability, we're going to also believe him regarding this qualification. So we're basically going to be saying that we're going to be trusting the case that it was tithed, which again is a nuance that is added to the last nuance. We wouldn't have known that this should be believed. If we didn't have this Mishnah, we would say okay, well, we trust that it comes from Eretz Yisrael, but we still can't trust that he said that it's tithed. Well, why do we trust that it's tithed? Well, we know that this is Demai, and you're buying Demai from the Am Haaretz, and perhaps this Am Haaretz actually did tithe it, or perhaps he bought it from a Haver. So that's going to be the case. So the Mishnah is going to continue, and it's going to say, if the Am Haaretz says the produce is from my own field in Syria, the buyer is obligated to tithe the produce. So basically, the Rosh is saying about this that if the seller declares that the produce grew in a field he owns in Syria, the buyer has to tithe it as Demai. Why? Because yes, Syria is not biblically regarded as part of Eretz Yisrael in this Maloket Tanayim, but the rabbis instituted that it should be part of this enactment of Demai, and ordinarily the Demai obligations are not relevant when you go and you buy produce in a Syrian market because it's assumed that it's coming from a non-Jewish area. But in this case, the seller is identifying that the produce was grown on his own property in Syria. And so in this case, the owner is a Jew. It's most likely that he grew it and did the processing himself. And so the buyer has to treat it as Demai. He has to take out all the tithes. So the Mishnah continues, says, but if the Am Haaretz says the produce has already been tithed, he is believed, for the very mouth that has forbidden the produce by declaring it to be from his own field is a mouth that permitted the produce by declaring it to already be tithed. And this is going to be kind of interesting. If it wasn't for the seller's assertion that the produce is from his own land in Syria, you wouldn't, the produce would not have to be tithed. And that's going to be because the seller's word is going to render the produce subject to the tithing obligation, so that when he adds that the produce is already tithed, he's going to be believed. And in the last case, it's going to be where, if the seller declares that the produce grew in a field he owns, the buyer has to tithe it, okay? And that's going to be because Syria is not biblically regarded as Eretz Yisrael, but the rabbi said, okay, you have to still tithe it as Demai. And over here, the seller's word is going to be that the produce is subject to the tithing obligation. And then the Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say, if, however, it is already known that the seller has a field in Syria, the buyer is obligated to tithe the produce, because in that situation, there's no basis to accept the seller's claim that the produce has already been tithed. So what we're seeing here is, says the Rosh, that if, independent of the seller's assertion that the produce is from my own field, and he's known to own land in Eretz Yisrael, he doesn't just say, oh, I own land in Syria and I tithed it. He's now making a different claim. He's saying, oh, the land is from Syria and it's my land. And you know from elsewhere that he actually does own land there. Well, we're not going to believe him when he claims that the produce has already been tithed, because unlike ordinary market produce in Syria, which is normally going to come from outside of Eretz Yisrael or from non-Jewish owned property, this produce now is going to be presumed from the seller's own field. And even though the landowner normally markets his own produce, even if he claimed that the produce came from outside of Eretz Yisrael, his word would not have been accepted, and the produce would need to be tithed, since the tithing obligation applies in this situation, regardless of whether the seller says there's no migo to substantiate his claim. And the Rosh is saying that the produce has already been tithed, and that's not going to be valid. The buyer has to now regard this as Demai and tithe it. The Rambam is going to say like this about it. He's basically going to be saying that when the Rambam states that a person who buys produce in Syria is not obligated to treat the produce as Demai, he's referring to a situation where the buyer has no specific knowledge about the origin of the produce. And so in the last cases, as Rambam's pointing out, the guy just says, oh, I have a field and I grew it. The case now in this Mishnah is that he's making a claim, and you also have other knowledge that he actually does have a field. And now you have this specific knowledge. And because it is assumed to have come from outside of Eretz Yisrael, and now you know that it came from Syria, now you know it came from Jewish-owned land in Syria, it is subject to the Demai obligation. And that's why you're not going to believe him on it, and you're going to tithe it. Now, if this Amma Aretz was in Eretz Yisrael, for example, okay, and he said, oh, I have land here, and you know he has land there, okay, it's the exact same case except not Syria, it's in Eretz Yisrael. And the Amma Aretz comes and testifies, oh, I'm selling this produce and I tithed it. He's not believed. So over here in Syria, this is covering the same kind of case where he says he owns land. You now know he actually does own the land and it came from that area. Well, he's not going to be believed in that case. And when he's saying that, the produce has already been tithed, well, now it goes back to him being an Amma Aretz. And, you're going to, not believe the Amma Aretz in those cases. So the first two cases of those Mishnahs are really cases of migo, where if he said nothing, then, he weakened his claim. But in the third case, that's not really a case of migo anymore. Now you have independent knowledge that he actually does own a field, and now his testimony is basically invalid. That's really what this is trying to say. The Gemaras are pretty short, and we're going to talk about this first case about the convert and his non-Jewish brother, and they're going to inherit idols and Nesach wine from the idol-worshipping father. And again, as we were talking about, this is a case where it's inheritance to Rabbanan. And the Gemara says, if a Jew and a non-Jew acquired the house of a non-Jew, and there were Nesach wine, idols, and money there in the house, the Jew may not say to his partner, you take the Nesach wine and idols, and I take the money. So this sort of exchange is not allowed, because this would result in the Jew of getting benefit from the share of idols and Nesach wine. And that's how the Gemara is starting off, right? You have a partnership between a Jew and a non-Jew, and they acquired the house of a non-Jew, and now, once they acquired it, they now have joint ownership of it, and they have joint ownership of this idol. So effectively, what they would be doing, what the Jew would be doing, is he'd be getting benefit by making this split. He has no value or benefit from the idols or the Nesach wine, and he does have value from the money. So by saying, okay, you take the idols and the wine and I take the money, then what's happening is he's creating value out of that idol. Because again, he owned half the idol. So the Gemara is going to comment on this ruling, and Rabbi Yochanan said the matter, this prohibition stated in the above brisa, does not end with situations involving Nesach wine, idols, and money, because they are completely dissimilar objects. And again, as we're going to be getting into a sugya that comes up later with Rabbi Zera, this is actually going to be applying later on with even a haver and an am haaretz who's going to be getting dissimilar objects. And what do you do with these dissimilar objects? The Gemara says, rather, even if the previous owner had in the house two images, one that is made like a cupboard, and it's saying like a wooden cabinet used to store wine cups, and in this case, it's constructed with some sort of idol figure in the compartments or the utensils and the decor of this, okay? The Gemara says that, and one that is not made like a cupboard. So this is talking about a utensil area that has like moons and dragons and other objects of idol worship, and then you have one that is just a plain cupboard. And the Gemara says that the Jew may not tell his partner, you take the cupboard with the images that is not made like a cupboard, which presumably had objects that could have been worshipped, and I will take the other one that is made like a cupboard, which is clean and doesn't have these images on it, which presumably was not worshipped. So even though both the objects are the same kind, the exchange is going to be forbidden. Now, normally when partners divide jointly owned property of a single kind, the transaction is not viewed as a mutual transferring of shares. So in this case, due to the principle of Beur, the division of property retroactively clarifies which portion belonged to which partner from the very beginning. So in other words, when you're saying you take this cupboard with the images and I take this cupboard without the images, that's going to be a case of Beur, because in the beginning you both owned half of them. Half of this cupboard with images was owned by the Jew, half of this cupboard with the images without the images was owned by the Jew, and the other half was owned by the non-Jew. Again, it's not that there's two cupboards and one owns one and one owns the other. On each cupboard, you literally own half of it, okay? And so now by retroactively clarifying it, you're making Beur. And so this is going to be circling back to chapter 6, halacha 6. And in this case of Beur, the reason that the one with the images is prohibited on account of the idol worship images and the others not, is that they're going to be regarded as dissimilar objects. And since the exchange would not be retroactively clarified through the principle of Beur, then effectively the Jew is trading his share in something that's forbidden for something that's permitted, and he's basically getting benefit from the forbidden image. That's the explanation by Rabbi Kanievsky about this. The Gemara is going to get further into this with Rabbi Zera's clarification. Rabbi Zera says, and this is indeed correct, and consider the following. If there was a haver and an am haaretz who inherited the possessions of their father, who was also an am haaretz, and there in the inheritance were both produce that had been rendered susceptible to tuma, as well as produce that had not been rendered susceptible to tuma, could the haver possibly tell the am haaretz, you take the produce that has become susceptible to tuma, like it became wet at one point, and I will take the produce that has not been susceptible to tuma. And basically what this is teaching is you can't do this. And we learned in this last Mishnah about this, that the haver who inherits together with the am haaretz may not say, you take the wet produce and I take the dry produce. And despite the fact that the produce is all the same species, like let's say it's all wheat, the portion that is susceptible to tuma is going to be considered a different variety than the one that is not susceptible to tuma. So because there's a different halachic status, it may not be exchanged. And why? Because it's going to be considered like a different species. And so that's following what Rabbi Yochanan is saying here as well, that the permitted image is not considered to be the same kind as the forbidden image. And therefore, the Jewish partner may not make this kind of exchange in the forbidden image. Now, this is very much getting into like what Rebbe is saying. Rebbe is saying that, wait a second, when you own 1,000,000 kernels of wheat together as a partnership, okay, you don't own 500,000 kernels and he owns 500,000 kernels. You own 1,000,000 kernels, and of each of these kernels, you own half the kernel. That's the insight in chapter 6, halacha 6 from Rebbe. And that's very much over here. In other words, as soon as you get partnership, as Rabbi Yochanan is saying, that you already own half of this idle cupboard, and you own half of this clean cupboard. And now when you're making an exchange, you're exchanging something that has no value to you for something that does have value to you, okay, because you already own half of it. So that's basically why it's going to be forbidden, because you're making something where you're getting value and benefit off of something prohibited, like an idol. And so over here, in the case of a Jew who was a convert and a non-Jewish brother who made an inheritance, you can get into these same sorts of problems with regards to idols. And you can also get the same kinds of benefits where, let's say, there's only wheat. Well, if there's only dry wheat and wet wheat, you would be able to make this kind of exchange with the convert who inherited along with his idol-worshipping brother, because, again, that's inheritance to Rabbanan, and it didn't come into your possession simultaneously. So normally it's going to be treated as two different species, but over here you're going to be able to make that exchange. So that's part of the nuance and part of why we need to know this in the Mishnah. The Gemara is going to raise an apparent contradiction between the brisa that was said earlier and this one. Again, it's comparing between chapter 6 halacha 6 and chapter 6 halacha 7. It says, but the Mishnah seemingly argues with this brisa, and the Mishnah states that if a convert and his non-Jewish brother inherited their non-Jewish father, the convert must say to his brother, you take the idols and I take the money, you take the nesach wine and I take the produce. And this apparently indicates that the Jew who owns the idols and the nesach wine in partnership with the non-Jew is allowed to exchange his share for permitted items. In other words, this is saying, but wait a second, in the case Rabbi Yochanan said of the two Jewish, the Jewish and non-Jewish partner who bought a house of a non-Jew, and there's idols inside the house, isn't this really going to be like the case of the inheritance that we're talking about? And actually it's not going to be. It's actually going to be different. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, recite the final clause of the Mishnah's ruling. It says, and you will not find that the Mishnah does not argue with this brisa at all, because the conclusion of this Mishnah reads, it says, if the idols and the nasach wine have already come into the convert's possession, it is forbidden to exchange them for money or produce. So again, when they're getting this inheritance, until he's actually making a kinyan, until the convert's actually making a kinyan of this stuff, and he's actually getting it, it's not actually in his possession yet. That's the nuance. But over here, if it's already come into his possession, now you can't make this kind of exchange. And over here, in Rabbi Yochanan's case about the Jew and the non-Jew acquiring the house of a non-Jew, it comes into their joint possession immediately. And that's going to be the case. So the Gemara says, here, therefore, in the case of the brisa, since the Jew acquired a share in the forbidden items the moment the partnership was established, it's equivalent to this last case in the Mishnah where the forbidden items have already entered the convert's possession. So that is why the brisa is ruling that the idols and the nesach wine may not be exchanged for the permitted objects. The Gemara is going to cite a brisa that records an incident that actually copies this case. Achilas, the convert, divided the inheritance of his non-Jewish father along with his non-Jewish brother, which included some idols, and he took money instead of the portion of the idols. And the Gemara says, but he was stringent with himself and transported the benefit he received in exchange for the idols to the Dead Sea and cast it in. So, by the way, a lot of these idols were made of gold and silver, so they were quite valuable. So the Gemara is going to talk about another opinion as to what exactly happened with Achilas, the convert, casting it into the sea. And the Gemara continues, says the details of the incident were addressed by 3 Amorim. One said that Achilas transported the entire value of the idol to the Dead Sea and threw it into the Dead Sea. Another one said he transported the value of his share in the idol to the Dead Sea and threw it in. Another said that he transported the idol itself to the Dead Sea and threw it in. And rather than take the money in exchange for the portion of the idol, he let his brother take the money so that he should acquire the entire share of the idol and then destroy it. So he did this not because he was obligated to, but simply because he wished to uproot idol worship from the house of his father. So the third opinion, which maintains that Achilas, the convert, threw the idol itself into the sea, is going to be consistent with this Bryce's statement that he was trying to uproot the portion. So the mission now is going to move on to the statement that the Am Haaretz, who is selling produce in Syria, is known to own a field there. And in this case, he's not believed to claim that the produce has already been tithed. The Gemara is going to point out something in Masechet Peah that looks like a contradiction. This is going to be in Peah 8.2. And it says, we learned in a Mishnah that they, all poor people, even those who are in Am Haaretz, are believed with regard to leket, shchicha, and peah during their season. In other words, poor people are going to be believed to claim that the produce they got or that they're selling is going to be leket, shchicha, and peah, which, by the way, those are exempt from tithes. And it's going to be provided that the claim is made at a time when the gifts to the poor are still available in the fields. So while the Am Haaretz is not believed to say that the tithe, that he tithed his produce, a poor Am Haaretz is going to be believed to say that his produce did not require the tithing in the first place because it came from leket, shchicha, and peah. There's going to be no tithes on the gifts of the poor from a field. And again, that kind of gets into like hefker rules. So because this has this like quasi status of hefker about being available to all of the people to collect, basically it's going to be a case where, like hefker, you don't have to tithe it. And so over here, this also doesn't need to be tithed. Now, the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, but here in our Mishnah, you say that when an Am Haaretz is known to have a field in Syria, he is not believed to claim that the produce he is selling has already been tithed. So our Mishnah clearly holds that the Am Haaretz would not have been believed if he had declared that the produce came from the non-Jew's field or from outside of Eretz Yisrael, because if he would be believed in these incidents, then he ought to just accept the present claim that the produce is already tithed. So basically this is asking, isn't this in contradiction with Peah? Because the Mishnah is teaching over there that a poor Am Haaretz is believed to claim that his produce is from leket, shchicha, and peah, which you don't need to worry about tithe, and he's going to believe the non-claim, basically. He's claiming that it doesn't need tithes. And this Mishnah is indicating that the Am Haaretz is not believed to claim that his produce is from the field of a non-Jew or from outside of Eretz Yisrael. So the Gemara is basically going to be answering like this, okay? And there, in the case of Peah, even if the person were to say nothing about the origin of the produce, his silence would result in the produce being exempt from tithes because we would assume it is from leket, shchicha, and peah. And that, by the way, is going to be the halacha. He is therefore believed when he claims that the produce is from one of these gifts of the poor. But here, however, in our Mishnah's case, if the Am Haaretz who's selling the produce had kept quiet about the origin, his silence would result in the produce being subject to tithes, because we would assume that it came from his own field. And again, if we have a case where it comes from his own field, and you know he has a field, you know that he has to tithe it. It is subject to tithes. So if he said nothing, you would have to tithe it. And consequently, he would not be believed to claim that the produce is from a non-Jew's field or from outside of Eretz Yisrael. So we're not going to believe him when he's declaring that the produce has already been tithed. So over here, Rabbi Kanievsky is saying that the point here is that the Am Haaretz never has real credibility with regard to the status of his produce. And his claim is accepted in the case of the Mishnah and Peah only because the produce is anyway assumed to be from Lechet, Shkika, and Peah, which, by the way, is still in the field. That's going to be the case and condition in 8.2 and Peah, is that it's still there in the field. It hasn't left the field yet. In other words, that anybody can go down and collect it in this case. And so okay, there's a field over here, and they're growing it, and it's not like, this has been out of season for 6 months. So the ruling in that Mishnah doesn't contradict this Mishnah regarding the Am Haaretz, who's known to own a field in Syria. And the default assumption is that the produce does need to be tithed. So the Gemara is going to confirm this answer. It's going to say, and a Brisa taught, in a case where an Am Haaretz's silence would result in the produce being exempt from tithes, he's believed, even in order to be lenient with the produce. But in a situation where his silence would result in the produce being treated stringently, while his actual declaration tries to make a leniency and exempt the produce from tithes, he's not believed. So what this is trying to say is look, if he said nothing, you would assume that this came from his field and that you'd have to tithe it. But over here, in a case where he's going to be saying, it's already been tithed, he's trying to create a leniency because, again, he's trying to get different value out of this item, okay? Because he's saying, it's been tithed. And so by trying to get this leniency, he's not believed. This gets very much into the last part of this case in the Mishnah because, again, if he has a field and you know he has a field, he's not going to be trusted because he's an Am Haaretz. That's part of the problem. He's not trusted if he's an Am Haaretz. And over here, he's basically, the difference here is that he's making a nuanced claim that is trying to make a leniency. He's trying to say it's already been tithed, don't worry about it. Now, if he said nothing on the stringent side, you'd have to tithe it. So by trying to say something leniently, like, don't worry, you don't have to tithe it, he's not believed. The Gemara, and by the way, the Mishnah's other cases are going to be where it's the opposite case. Okay, if he's in Syria and he's saying, this came from Eretz Yisrael, that's going to be a stringency. He's testified against his own produce, and so he's going to get a different value, a lower value for his produce. That's going to be part of the difference. And over here, if he says nothing, you have to tithe it. And over here, if he says something, he's trying to get a higher value for this already tithed product. But really, this is going to be a case where, he's not believed. The Brisa is going to continue. We're going to finish this up pretty quickly. It says, the Brisa taught a non-Jewish merchant who was crying out and saying, come and take fruits for yourself from me. They are fruits of Azek. Azek, by the way, are going to be protected gardens, and generally food from protected areas are going to be higher quality. That's going to be because somebody is putting actual interest into tending it and trying to create better quality fruit. Also because it keeps people in or out from, handling the fruit and maybe damaging the tree. And so this could be relevant in the case of Shemitah because the Torah demands that all produce is left out as hefker. And basically, you have a non-Jew who's trying to say that this fruit is superior because it's guarded produce. And, inadvertently, he would be communicating that it's prohibited to a Jew because fruit that's in a guarded field during Shvius can't be eaten. So that's really what he's trying to communicate. He's accidentally testifying against the fruit, effectively. The Gemara continues, says, or they are fruits of Orla, or they are fruits of Neta Revai. It's not believed. Why? The buyer doesn't need to be worried that the fruits are actually from one of these categories because we assume that the seller meant only to embellish the quality of the goods, and there's no actual truth to his pronouncement. So the idea is that, says the Rosh Cirilio, since the seller's words are his personal interest and he's trying to enhance the value of it, he might not even know what orla is. Rashi's pointing out that we presume with certainty that the fruits belong to the majority of all fruits, which is not from the type that the seller claims, and that's why it's going to be permissible. So the Gemara is going to continue and say, however, if he says, I bought these fruits here from the crop of so-and-so, the non-Jew, he is believed in order to be stringent with the produce. These are the words of Rebbe, but the sages say his words are inconsequential. In other words, that it doesn't raise or lower the value of this, and the sages are holding that we completely disregard the seller's words, and he's not believed even with stringencies. And the Marafulda says, because in this case, the declaration is assumed to be nothing more than an attempt to increase the marketability of the produce. And that's why the sages say that it's not relevant. The Gemara is going to get into another part of this topic. Rabbi Yudan inquired and says, if the Gentile was speaking about the origin of his produce and in his innocence, he says during ordinary conversation that they're going to be from Azek or La or Neta Revai, is he not going to be believed? That, by the way, is going to be unanswered. And Rabbi Yudan is going to be inquiring that in a case where the non-Jew mentions in a casual manner that this is Orla, are we going to say that he's telling the truth or not? There's some question as to how this is actually written, and it could perhaps be where he's actually going to be saying that even in a casual manner, he's not going to be given, he's not going to be given credibility. So the Mishnahs or the Gemaras are going to be finishing up now, and it's going to resolve this question. Okay, this matter is actually subject to dispute, and the rabbis disagreed in the following brisa. It says about the Kuthian status, a Kuthian is considered as a non-Jew. These are the words of Rebbe, and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says a Kuthian is considered as a Jew in all matters. Again, this is a maloket that we talked about earlier in Demai on. Rebbe is ruling later on after they discovered these idols. And so even in that case, the Kuthians were declared not Jewish, but they still themselves considered themselves to be Jewish and still trying to do some of that stuff. So that's what makes the Kuthian case a little bit curious. It's not just stam like a regular non-Jew, that they at one point were considered Jews, then they were defrocked of being Jews, and they themselves still kept trying to keep the stuff, some of the stuff, and they still regarded themselves as Jews. So in some way, there's going to be some cases where they're still going to be believed. So part of when you're looking at the Kuthian is you have to ask, well, when is this? When are we talking about the Kuthian? That's part of the case whenever we're looking at a Kuthian in either Shas. So the Mishnah now talks about the Am Haaretz who's selling produce in Syria, and he's declaring that the produce is from his own field and has already been tithed. And over there, he's believed unless you already know that he owns this field. Okay, you have this extra knowledge. And so if the Gemara says it is otherwise known that the seller has this field in Syria, the buyer is obligated to tithe the produce. So the Gemara is going to qualify the ruling. Rabbi Bon Barchia says this is true only when we assume that the majority of that which the seller brings into the storehouse and sells is from his own field in Syria, and otherwise he is believed to claim that the produce has already been tithed. Now, a related law, it says if a Jew has a sharecropper who's an Am Haaretz and they're working land in Syria, and the sharecropper sent produce to the landowner and declared, this produce is tithed, I say that he obtained the produce from the local market in Syria rather than from the field he's working. Hence, the produce does not need to be tithed. But this is true only when that particular kind of produce is commonly found in the market and in the fields. And as long as that condition is satisfied, this leniency is not limited to instances in which the sharecropper does not have from that kind of produce in the field. Rather, even if he does have from that kind of produce in the field, says the Gemara, since his kind of produce is commonly found in the market, it is permitted to be consumed without tithing. In other words, says the Marafulda, even if the field where the sharecropper is working has produce of the same kind that he delivers to the owner, we still assume that the produce comes from a local Syrian market because we do not suspect the sharecropper of taking produce from the field, even his own portion, without receiving specific approval from the owner. And, as long as, this kind of produce is commonly found in the local market, he's going to be believed. And, basically, over here, we're going to be looking at, we're assuming that the sharecropper says that the portion is tithed, and what he really means is that the produce is completely exempt from tithes because it came from the local market, says the Pnei Moshe. And the Vilna Goan says about this, to finish up, that there's no concern that the sharecropper, in fact, took the produce from the field he's working in, and he's not suspected of removing produce from the field without the owner's knowledge. Why? Because we're not assuming he stole it. Okay? So when he's saying that, it's already going to be tithed, when he's saying, oh, I took this from the market, I brought it from the market. He's not saying that I took the portion without notifying you, and now I tithed it on your behalf. And that's really what this is saying. Have a great day.